Welcome to Faith and Freedom, an audio feature produced by the Wagner Faith and Freedom Center located on the campus of Spring Arbor University. The Wagner Faith and Freedom Center serves as the nation's academic voice for faith, family, and freedom. And now here's your host for Faith and Freedom, Professor William Wagner.
Hello, welcome to Faith and Freedom. I'm Will Wagner. Joining me on the program today is our Faith and Freedom Fellow, Noah. Welcome to the program. Today we turn our attention to an important development coming out of the United States Department of Justice. They've just released an important report. It's a report about the enforcement by the U.S. Department of Justice of something called the FACE Act, F-A-C-E, the enforcement between 2021 and 2024. This report raises real serious questions for the free exercise of expression and the free exercise of religious conscience. They're not merely political questions coming out of this report, but constitutional ones. Not merely legal questions, but moral ones. At its core, the issue that we're going to be discussing today is this. Did the Department of Justice between 2021 and 2024 remain faithful to its calling to administer justice without fear or favor to anyone or anyone's political preferences, or did it stray into something pretty troubling? The selective use of government power, was that what was happening here? As someone who once served in the United States Department of Justice as the Senior Assistant United States Attorney, I don't approach this subject in a casual way because I know firsthand what the Department of Justice is supposed to do and how it's supposed to operate. It's supposed to be a place where the rule of law governs, not political pressure. It's supposed to be a place where evidence determines outcomes, not ideology. It's supposed to be a place where justice is pursued, not weaponized. And so today, I want to carefully examine what this Department of Justice report actually says about the law enforcement activities of the Justice Department between 2021 and 2024, and what it reveals about the Department of Justice's enforcement specifically of the FACE Act, and what it means for especially people of faith, what it means for constitutional governance, and what it means for the future of justice in this great nation. So let's begin with some foundational things so we can understand what we're really talking about here. The FACE Act was enacted in 1994. Its purpose during its enactment was pretty straightforward, actually. It's to prohibit the use of force, to prohibit the use of threat of force, to prohibit physical obstruction or to interfere with individuals obtaining or providing health services or exercising religious freedom at places of worship. So notice that carefully, the way that Congress actually enacted the statute. The statute is facially fair on its face. It protects access to medical clinics. It protects access to pregnancy resource centers. It protects access to churches and places of worship. So, in other words, the law is not a problem. The law itself is not a problem. The Constitution doesn't forbid laws like this. Indeed, government has a legitimate role in maintaining order and preventing violence and ensuring public safety. Indeed, the Bible says that the government has a very specific role here. Condone that which is good and punish that which is evil. But here's where the constitutional concern, in my view, arises. A law that is fair on its face can still be applied in a way that is profoundly unfair. And when enforcement becomes selective, when it targets one group, especially a group based on their faith and their conscience, when it targets one group of faith and overlooking other groups, then we're no longer dealing with equal justice under law. We're dealing with something else. And so at this point, I want to bring in our Faith and Freedom fellow, Noah. As you are listening to the purpose of the FACE Act, what stands out to you about the importance of laws written in a way that is fair and neutral on its face? Why is that important, do you think?
I mean, ultimately, I think it sets the stage for how that law is supposed to be interpreted and used. For example, for the FACE Act, it's supposed to be used for anybody who's getting denied access to, medical centers or
somebody's exercising violence outside of those places. Yeah.
So I just think it's extremely important. If it's skewed either any way, then I think it marginalizes groups.
It marginalizes groups. I think you're absolutely right. I think what it also does, it kind of undermines the legitimacy of the law enforcement institutions as well. Don't you think if a law enforcement institution out there, whether it be the police or the FBI in this case, if they're targeting people based on their faith as opposed to whether somebody is breaking a law, you're either looking for a crime or you're looking for a person, and then you make up the crime to to go after the person you want to. And that latter approach, undermines the integrity of the law enforcement institution, itself, I think. And so, and on top of what you were talking about, it just, if we're not fair, if our legal system, and especially where you have the power of the sword, if the power of the sword isn't being used in a fair way, the people see that very, very quickly, and it undermines our institutions. And so I want to get into the report a little deeper now, because the DOJ report released just now examines enforcement patterns under the FACE Act during the years 2021, 2024, sometime within that time period. And the report raises serious concerns about the disproportionate prosecution of pro-life individuals. And when I'm talking about pro-life individuals, more often than not, I'm talking about people of faith and people of conscience that are standing for the inherent dignity that all human life has because it's made in the very image of God. And so that report raises concern about disproportionate targeting of those individuals. It raises concerns about the very limited or sometimes absent enforcement against acts targeting people on the other side. Pro-life pregnancy centers faced huge amounts of threats of violence. Churches faced threats of violence, and there were literally very limited, if any, enforcement at all against those kind of acts. And so choosing a person and going after that person, and then finding a crime to go after that person, as opposed to seeing conduct that is criminal and then following that conduct to see who the bad guy was. And so this report raises concerns in those areas, as well as a concern over the use of federal law enforcement resources in ways that appear very uneven and very unfair. And very specifically, the report is pointing to some high-profile prosecutions of pro-life advocates. And it's interesting that they always targeted only the side that was pro-life. The report also points to some aggressive arrest tactics in a number of cases, and a comparative lack of federal law enforcement action when the attack was on a pro-life facility. So, to be clear, I think if we're going to have a legitimate justice system, we must approach all these kinds of claims with careful scrutiny. And so the question is not whether prosecutions occurred. They did. There's no question about that. The question is not whether real violations of law should be prosecuted. If there's a real violation of law out there, law enforcement should follow the criminal conduct and wherever it leads to, whoever it leads to. They should. The real question is, were similar violations treated similarly, or were they treated differently based on the viewpoint of the individuals involved, based on whether or not it was furthering some political agenda as opposed to investigating crime? Because making sure that similar violations are treated the same, that everyone is equal under the law, that is the constitutional standard. Not equal outcomes, but equal application, equality under the law. And so I want to bring Noah in, again, when you hear concerns about uneven enforcement or unfair enforcement, what questions as a young person come to your mind about how government power is being exercised?
Yeah, I mean, I think it raises a lot of questions. Like, I think the older I've gotten, I'm not very old, so the more I've learned, the older I've gotten, that's been called more into question. I think it's really caused a lot of people in my generation to question those things. I've even seen a lot of people in my generation kind of like go away from politics at all. Like, they could care less whether it's for them or against them. They just want to stay out of it because of how much it can sway. It seems like something as a kid I didn't realize and that I do now is like one department can do one thing, the next department can do the exact opposite, even within using the same law in very different applications, and sometimes, like as you're saying, I think not very equitable ways.
Yeah, and that's the last thing we want, with the next generation of citizens, because we want citizens who are engaged in citizen statesmanship and who are wanting to be part of society and wanting to be part of the governing structure. And if we've got a kind of use of force and a weaponization of the government in a way that so discourages people from wanting to participate, that's not a good thing for the future, of the nation. So I'm glad that there are people like you, and I'm glad we've got the Faith and Freedom Fellowship so that we can, find individuals that are going to be willing to courageously stand, but do it with compassion and do it with respect, and to be willing to speak up for fairness and equality, under the law. I do want to move to the next segment that I want to talk about is what is the constitutional framework here? Because we spend a lot of time on this program talking about Christian worldview, but we also talk about how our Constitution is supposed to work and how our constitutional structure of government is supposed to work here. And our Constitution demands something profoundly important from those who hold and exercise government power. It demands fairness. The First Amendment protects the government from targeting, actually it protects individuals from the government targeting individuals because of their beliefs, because of their speech, because of their expression, or because of their religious convictions, because of their conscience. The Fifth Amendment guarantees due process. And so embedded within this great constitutional tradition of our nation is the principle of equal justice under law. That principle must mean that the law must not favor one viewpoint over another. Prosecutors must not pursue cases based on ideology or based on some political preference of those holding power at the time. And enforcement must not reflect political alignment or political preference. So only the guys that disagree with our political position gets targeted and prosecuted. So the Supreme Court has made clear that selective prosecution, especially when based on impermissible considerations like a person's religious conscience, that is absolutely unconstitutional. Now, I gotta say, to be sure, proving that kind of thing sometimes might be difficult. Why? Well, because it requires that you show that others similarly situated were not prosecuted. Well, here the report is pretty clear. That's exactly what happened. And that, in my view, undermines the institutional legitimacy of our justice institutions. And so where a decision to prosecute, as apparently the report shows here, is based on improper motive, that's not a good thing. So we've got to ask these questions. We've got to talk about them. And without fear or favor to any political party or any political preference, we want to find out what the right standard is. And so let me ask our Faith and Freedom Fellow again, hearing about how the Justice Department operated in these prior years, what difference do you perceive compared to some of the type of things that we're looking at today, and some of the things we've been discussing, for example, over the last couple months at the Faith and Freedom Center?
Yeah, like when I look back at, I'm a history major, when I look about history, it seems like generally rules were applied pretty equitably. There are times where that hasn't been the case, and usually that gets called out and it gets fixed, though, in those times. So now it's interesting to see how volatile the governance can be. I kind of mentioned earlier, but like how one administration can rule completely different than the other using the same laws is kind of concerning, I think. The fact that I think it kind of shows that like some of our laws might not have as much weight as like I would have thought, for example, that ultimately it's the execution of the laws that matter the most. And that leaves, I think, a lot of things up in the air.
And it needs to be fair. Now,
Yeah.
I had the privilege of serving under numerous Democratic administrations and numerous Republican administrations. So, my boss, being the Attorney General at the time, could have, been appointed by a Republican president or could have been appointed by a Democratic president. And back in those times, and I guess I'm dating myself because I'm on the other side from the elder side of things here. But back in those times, it didn't matter whether the president was a Republican or a Democrat appointing a Republican or a Democrat in the Attorney General, because once they took the oath of office, the Attorney General carried out the role of the Department of Justice without fear or favor to any political party. And if a crime was committed, you followed the evidence and you saw where the evidence led, and it led to the bad guy, and then you prosecuted the bad guy. You didn't ask if they had a D after their name or an R after their name. Mm-hmm. What we've got here seems to be a very different approach, where whoever's in power, they say, well, let's go after the other letter. And let's go after, our political opponents, those who don't disagree with us. And if that's what was happening in those years, a few years ago, that is profoundly dangerous, I think, for faith and freedom. It's profoundly dangerous for a constitutional republic grounded in the rule of law and grounded in good governance. And so I want to get a little bit deeper into my personal experience, because when I served as the United States, the senior assistant United States attorney, that culture within the department was so different, and we understood something very clearly. We didn't represent a political party. We represented the people of the United States of America. Our obligation was not to we weren't there to advance anybody's political agenda, but we were there to seek justice. We prosecuted white-collar crime, things like wire fraud, things like mail fraud, violent crimes against children, interstate trafficking of children, drug trafficking, organized criminal activity. And we did so based on the evidence, not some kind of political ideology. There was a clear understanding. I mean, you'd be fired if you thought about prosecuting and pursuing something based on political ideology. And the understanding was very clear. You do not target individuals because of who they are. You don't target them because of what they believe. You hold people accountable for what they do. And that matters, without fear or favor. And that really matters, that we do it that way. Without fear, meaning we don't shrink back from enforcing the law. If we see a crime, we follow the evidence, and no matter where it leads, if it leads to whoever it leads to, you pursue justice. And without favor, meaning we don't selectively enforce it. Meaning when we follow the evidence, if it lands on one of our friends, that we don't turn a blind eye. If it lands on one of our enemies, we don't target the person because they are an enemy. We target the crime, and we enforce the law against the lawbreaker. Unfortunately, I think what happened in those years, a few years ago, is that because of it, many Americans are asking whether that commitment got compromised. I tell you, the report was it was scary the more that I read it. When heavily armed federal agents are deployed in cases involving nonviolent people, when individuals are prosecuted for conduct that in other contexts appears to go completely unaddressed, when people of faith perceive that their deeply held convictions, and no, this is, I think, what you were talking about a little bit, when people of faith perceive that their deeply held convictions place them under heightened scrutiny just because of who they are, then guess what? Then the trust in the justice system begins to erode. And when that trust erodes and begins to chip away, the rule of law itself is weakened. And that is, I think, a very, very dangerous thing. So, Noah, what do you see as the danger if government begins, even subtly, to treat certain viewpoints differently under the law?
I think, one, obviously it marginalizes, whatever group is getting the short end of the stick with that. But I think also it will probably spiral quicker than we'd think it would. I think when you give an inch, a mile gets taken. You know what I mean? I think for me that'd be the biggest worry is that if one religion or one point of view or one anything got kind of marginalized, that it would very quickly kind of spiral out and become more than that.
And I don't think that's an unfair worry, because when you look around the world where other governments have on even a more regular basis than what we saw happen a few years ago here at the Department of Justice, when they go down that road, I think that's exactly what we've seen throughout history to happen. And so I think that's a very astute point that you've made. I want to focus for a few minutes on a very specific case in some specific matters. One of the cases that drew national attention, the prosecution of a pro-life advocate. His name was Mark Houck, and this is reported in various news sources yesterday. Mr. Houck was charged under this FACE Act following some activity outside of a abortion clinic. And so the case involved a dispute over some kind of supposedly alleged physical contact. But when the local authorities investigated it, they declined to pursue the charges. They didn't feel that there was enough evidence there, supposedly, to actually prove the allegation. But then federal authorities stepped in. And that was the Department of Justice when I say federal authorities. And so the manner of the way they arrested this guy, they reportedly had a large number of armed agents, and again, that raises significant, concerns about how you are weaponizing the justice system and the resources of the Justice Department. And ultimately, this guy is tried by federal prosecutors, and a jury fully acquits him, and he's acquitted. Now, again, you have to be a little bit careful, because an acquittal doesn't automatically mean that the prosecutor wasn't improper, but it does raise some pretty significant questions, especially here where Mr. Houck then reportedly now secures a 7-figure civil settlement arising out of the circumstances surrounding his arrest and prosecution. And so that carries some significance. At a minimum, it reflects what many would view as an apparent vindication, a recognition that serious questions surrounded the government's conduct in this matter. And so when a citizen is acquitted by a jury of his peers and thereafter receives substantial compensation in a civil context, I think it ought to invite some sober reflection about what the Department of Justice was doing back then. And again, this isn't about a single case, but about a broader exercise of prosecution power, about prosecutorial discretion and the use of federal power in a way that appears to be very unfair. It underscores the importance of ensuring that justice ought to be pursued carefully. It ought to be pursued in a proportional way and without appearance of targeting individuals based on who they are, based on their beliefs, or based on their conscience or their convictions. And that, I think, is especially true, especially when considered alongside of the numerous documented attacks on pro-life pregnancy centers, that occurred. Incidents involving vandalism and threats and violence, and then very limited, if any, federal prosecution in those contexts. The issue isn't whether any one case was justified. The issue is whether the pattern that we saw here during those years reflects a fairness, reflects neutrality, or is it smelling like something else? Because the justice system has to be fair, appear to be fair. There has to be equal justice under law, or those justice institutions, the legitimacy of those institutions, erode and become quickly illegitimate. And so when you consider Mr. Houck's case, imagine being, you're out there doing you're protesting, you're peacefully protesting, and then you've got the full power of the federal government coming down, armed agents, and you're indicted, you're prosecuted, but then a jury finds you not guilty. And then another civil action is brought on your behalf, and you're able to secure a $7 million verdict based on what the government did. The government agreed to that settlement. When you consider a case like Mr. Houck's, his acquittal, his subsequent civil settlement, what does that suggest to you about the importance of restraint in the use of government power?
I think it's very important. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like a case like that probably should have never been anything bigger than a city or county level like policing situation. Would I be correct on that?
Yes.
So then I think
Normally.
it's very concerning. The fact that the DOJ can, for something as minor as a supposed like contact or physical alteration, no one got really injured from the sounds of it. Like the fact that the DOJ can send federal forces down to secure you, go after you, try to,
what do you think what kind of message do you think they were trying to send? Because they're obviously trying, in my view, trying to send a message not just to Mr. Houck, but to
everyone who's protesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everyone who's exercising First Amendment freedoms. Don't exercise it in this way.
Yeah.
Or you could be next.
Yeah.
So there is a deeper issue here, I think, and we do talk a lot about worldview on this program, and today we're going to talk about worldview and justice. And so at this point, I want to move beyond, the legal analysis that we've been talking about, because I think there's something deeper going on here. Law doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It very often is shaped by worldview. And if one believes that human life is sacred at conception, and if you likewise believe that conscience is a fundamental moral reality that is protected by the First Amendment, and that religious conviction and religious conscience deserves protection under the Constitution, then this kind of powerful federal enforcement, the powerful use of the sword by the federal government, that's problematic. Because if human life is sacred from conception, if religious conscience deserves protection, then when the government is using its power to enforce laws, especially criminal laws, the enforcement and the application of those laws need to reflect the constitutional limitations on the exercise of power. We're giving government huge amounts of power here to use the sword. But if government's given a huge amount of power to exercise the sword, they also have to remember the constitutional limits on the exercise of that power. And those limits include you don't use it in ways that interfere with the free exercise of religious conscience. So if you take a different worldview, though, if you had put on a different lens in the morning and you look at the world a completely different way from an atheist perspective, for example, and you say that the self is the highest value, personal autonomy is the highest value, my personal identity is the highest value, moral claims about life and human life, they're very subjective, and religious conviction, that ought to be viewed with suspicious. And we ought to be very suspicious of anybody that is religious. Well, then guess what? The application of law then all of a sudden significantly shifts, does it? Then it's okay to go after the religious person if you take a view of the world that autonomy is the highest value and that religious conviction and people with religious convictions ought to be viewed with suspicion. So what then appears to be neutral enforcement may in reality, just be moral relativism, and whoever's in power gets to enforce, their idea of, who is good and who is bad, as opposed to having the law be the standard and having evidence supporting whether the law was violated be the process that we go through. Instead, because we're in power, we get to target those we don't like. And when that happens, the law becomes a tool not of justice, but of ideology. And so, let me ask you, Noah, how do you see a worldview shaping the way people define justice, especially in a deeply contested issues like the sanctity of life?
I think it's interesting. That's a tough question in a way, because it's fascinating. I think that the worldview really affects how people perceive the laws, and it seems like both people groups then feel like they are the ones being marginalized, and I think that's where a lot of America's polarity is right now, is in those differing worldviews where both feel like they're getting marginalized because of this. And I think it's very dangerous when the government picks one or the other. I think it increases that marginalization. And yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing.
I think it's a real important point you just made, because we've been talking a lot about, this report is about how the left basically abused its power to further its own political agenda, and they used it against opponents, on the right. But the principle that we're talking about is neither left or right.
Yeah.
Nobody, whether you're on the left or right, ought to be using the federal law enforcement power, the justice institutions to further a political ideology. We're supposed to be just without fear or favor pursuing justice, not advancing a political ideology, whether it's from the left or the right. And that's, I think, a real important, message of what we're trying to convey here in this episode, is that this really isn't about politics as much as it's about, what kind of country will we have? Will we be like a lot of these other countries that who's ever in power gets to use their armed forces and gets to use, all their law enforcement power to oppress those they disagree with? Or will we be a constitutional republic under the rule of law, where those law enforcement powers are used to preserve our safety and security and to pursue justice?
Yep.
And so that brings me to, people of faith in the public square. For people of faith, this moment, I think, carries a very special kind of significance. The question is not whether Christians should engage in the public square, and this goes back to some of what you were talking about earlier. They must. The question is, how do we engage in the public square? We're called to speak truth with conviction. We're told to be courageous. We're supposed to act with courage, but we're always supposed to conduct ourselves with integrity, with compassion, with respect. And so we must also recognize, though, that the cost of faithfulness may increase over time. We've just saw that there could be a very large cost to standing for truth, even when you do it courageously, even when you do it compassionately with respect. So that cost of faithfulness may increase over time. The government institutions, if they again come back someday to begin treating religious conscience as suspect, and I'm seeing that in a number of states right now. I'm seeing it less in the federal government with regard to religious, folks, but I am seeing it more and more in some of these state institutions where the state is using its law enforcement power to treat religious conscience almost as something we should be worried about, be suspect about. If legal protections are applied unfairly, if they're not applied evenly to everyone, no matter who they are, then believers need to be prepared, I think, to stand. We need to be prepared to stand peacefully. We need to be prepared to stand lawfully and resolutely. We've got to make sure that still small voice of conscience gets to be part of the marketplace of ideas, even if it's at great cost to us. And we need to do it not in anger, but in truth and with compassion and respect. I just wonder, what challenges do you think, Noah, young Christians face today when living out their faith publicly?
I think it's interesting for us compared to maybe like your generation or generations of the past because of like social media. There are some people who are very out there there's a lot of people who are very out there on social media. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not too hard to do that, I feel like. But I've even noticed in my
that can
life.
be from the left or the right.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
And but I've noticed for myself even like, I'm coming from a Christian university, so it's kind of like a bubble there. So when I go out into the real world sometimes, there are times even where like I get challenged by a different point of view, and myself, I even kind of like shut up for a second and think like, oh, like, well, I'm used to this place, and I think like that's something that's probably pretty common among my generation.
Yeah.
Because I think my generation generally wants to be pretty peaceful. I don't think we want to have the polarity of the problems that we've, seen growing up. But I think we also have to be careful not to be overly like held back. Like I notice in myself that like I know I need to keep speaking about Christ and the gospel when I'm talking to people, no matter what they believe or what they think, and to do it still compassionately and rightly, and sometimes that may still offend people, but I think it's our job as Christians to speak the truth.
Yeah. Well, I love that, and I love the way this university does that. They never are ugly or violent or inappropriate. I just the students here just they literally are, they have hearts chasing after the Lord, and I think that goes a long way in this cultural discussion that we're having here. Is not just standing and talking as you were talking about, but the way you live your life as well too, because that actually speaks volumes, I think sometimes, and you may not be sharing the gospel or standing for truth in one of these hard cultural divide areas, but you may be feeding the hungry or providing housing, for somebody that doesn't have a home. There's a million different ways that Christians serve and show the heart of Jesus, in the way that they carry out their lives. And I think that's important that we continue doing that as well, because then when we do stand on some of these other issues, it's a person who's standing, who has fed the hungry, who has given a roof to somebody who didn't have one, who has clothed those who were cold in the wintertime. And so, that's a really good way to maybe kind of head toward the ending of this interview today, because my question that arises, where do we go from here? I think, back to the topic that we were talking about, we've got to first, I think we have to insist on some accountability. When bad things happen by government officials, that needs to be called out. The Department of Justice, I think, has done an important job by filing this report. But that's not enough. I think that it's really important the Department of Justice reaffirm its commitment to being fair, that the Department of Justice apply the law evenly without fear or favor, whether or not it's a Republican that's appointing the Attorney General or whether it's a Democrat appointing the Attorney General. The Department of Justice has to apply the law fairly so that we can restore public confidence in these judicial and law enforcement institutions. I think the second thing we have to do is, we got to, get some things clear here, and we have to pursue clarity. Congress has a role here. Congress, we've got separation of powers, and Congress has the power of oversight. They have the power of legislative refinement if they need to change this act in any way to make sure that the enforcement of the act is fair. Congress has a role to play in ensuring that statutes are not used in ways that undermine constitutional protections, especially First Amendment protections. And so, finally, I think we need to remain grounded a little bit. And the way we do that is, as Christian people, we know that our ultimate hope is not in government. It's not going to be in any law enforcement institution or any justice institution. Our ultimate hope is in truth and in the one who is the author of justice itself. And so the questions before us today aren't just legal questions. They really are foundational in a way. Will justice in America remain anchored in truth? Or are they going to, because of the way that the laws are applied, are they going to drift towards somebody's preferred political ideology? The DOJ report certainly raises concerns that deserve serious attention. Not partisan attention, folks, but principled attention. Because when justice is no longer blind, when law enforcement is no longer equal justice under the law, when citizens begin to wonder whether their beliefs and their conscience place them at risk, then guess what? We're no longer dealing with some kind of isolated problem. We're confronting a potential constitutional crisis. But I think there is a lot of time. I'm optimistic. There's time to restore integrity to our justice system and our justice institutions. There's time to reclaim principle, and there's time to ensure that the law once again can be enforced without fear and without favor, either to the left or to the right. And so it's time for us to take a break here. Stay with us, though, and when we come back, we'll tie it all together in our final wrap.
Growing deep roots means anchoring yourself to Jesus Christ, the source of all life and learning. Here at Spring Arbor University, faith and academics work hand in hand, grounding you in truth and wisdom. With a close-knit Christian community by your side, you'll grow strong, ready to face life's challenges. At SAU, you won't just learn, you'll thrive. Grow deep roots at Spring Arbor University. Visit arbor.edu today.
Welcome back to Faith and Freedom. And now, the final wrap. As we close today, let me leave you with this. At the end of the day, this conversation that we've been having is not simply about the FACE statute or even a report by the U.S. Department of Justice. I think it's about something far more fundamental. It's about whether justice in America will remain anchored to truth or whether it will become untethered, drifting with the currents of who's ever in power and whatever personal political ideology those in power have. Because when government begins to decide, whether they do it subtly or overtly, whose voice gets to matter, whose beliefs are protected, whose convictions should be suspect, well, guess what? Then justice is no longer blind. It becomes selective, and selective justice is no justice at all. But there is a deeper reality that we must not lose sight of. Scripture reminds us in Micah chapter 6, verse 8, He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That is the standard, not only for individuals, but for individuals who are in institutions. We are to act justly. We're to love mercy. We're to walk humbly. And so the call before us is clear. We must remain vigilant. We must remain faithful. And we must insist, respectfully, lawfully, but resolutely, that those entrusted with power of government, that they exercise that power not for political advantage, not for ideology, but for justice. True justice. Equal justice under law. Justice without fear and without favor. Thank you for joining us today on Faith and Freedom. I'm Will Wagner, and until next time, stand for truth. And never forget that freedom flourishes where faith is faithfully lived.